Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. They say the Appalachian Mountains hold secrets older than time itself. Tonight, you'll discover why locals refuse to camp there after dark. I've collected 6 true stories from people who ignored the warnings. What they found in those woods wasn't just scary, it was impossible. Things that shouldn't exist. Things that watched them. Things that followed them home. Quick, hit that subscribe button before we go deeper. Smash the like and tell me where you're from in the comments. One last thing, if you hear your name being called while watching this, don't answer. Ready? The forest is waiting. I'm 29 years old, and I haven't been able to sleep through the night in 3 years. My hands still shake when I hear certain sounds, branches breaking, footsteps in gravel, anything that sounds like breathing that isn't coming from a person. I used to be Dr. Sarah Chen, Research Coordinator for the National Park Service's Remote Ecosystem Monitoring Program. Now I stock shelves at a grocery store in Asheville, and I check the locks on my apartment door 6 times before bed. This happened during what was supposed to be a 6-week camping expedition in the most isolated section of the Pisgah National Forest, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. Our team was tasked with setting up a research station to monitor wildlife patterns and document ecosystem changes in an area that hadn't been properly studied since the 1960s. It was me, Dr. James Morrison from the University of Tennessee, Jamie to everyone, who'd been my research partner for 4 years, and if I'm being honest, the man I was probably going to marry when we got back to civilization. Lisa Rodriguez, our graduate research assistant, was 24 and brilliant with data collection. Mike Patterson was our wilderness survival expert, a former park ranger who knew these mountains better than anyone. We hiked in with enough supplies for 6 weeks. Scientific equipment, camping gear, solar panels to power our monitoring devices, and enough freeze-dried food to keep us fed. The plan was simple. Set up a base camp near a creek, establish monitoring stations throughout a 50-square-mile area, and document everything we found. Standard ecological research, the kind of work I'd been doing for 7 years without any problems. The first 2 weeks were perfect. The weather held, our equipment worked flawlessly, and we were collecting incredible data on black bear migration patterns and old-growth forest recovery. Jamie and I shared a tent, Lisa had her own, and Mike preferred sleeping under a tarp unless it was raining. We'd established a routine. Sunrise meant checking the overnight data. Days were spent hiking to monitoring stations and collecting samples. Evenings were for data processing and equipment maintenance. We had satellite communication for weekly check-ins with our supervisors, GPS units that worked perfectly, and detailed topographical maps of the entire area. Lisa was the first one to notice that something was wrong. She'd been organizing the data from our trail cameras. We'd set up dozens throughout the forest to monitor animal movement patterns. On our 15th day, she came back from downloading the camera data looking confused. "Sarah, can you look at something?" she asked, spreading printouts across our camp table. "I'm getting some weird results from the cameras." The photos showed normal forest scenes during the day. Deer, raccoons, the occasional black bear. But the nighttime photos were strange. In several shots, there were what looked like human figures standing perfectly still between trees, always at the very edge of the camera's range. The figures were tall, thin, and seemed to be watching our camp from a distance of maybe 200 yards. "Probably just hikers," Jamie said when we showed him. "People do illegal camping in wilderness areas all the time." But Mike shook his head. "Wrong. We're 40 miles from the nearest trail. Nobody hikes in here without serious equipment and navigation skills. And look at this." He pointed to one of the photos. Same figure, same exact position, but these shots are 3 days apart. The figure in the photos was unnaturally still, arms hanging straight down, head tilted at an angle that made me uncomfortable to look at. In every shot, it was facing directly toward our camp, even though our trail cameras were motion-activated and positioned in different directions. Could be a hunting stand, Lisa suggested. Maybe someone built a deer blind. Mike pulled out his binoculars and spent 20 minutes scanning the tree line where the photos had been taken. Nothing there, no structure, no signs of human activity. And I've been hunting these mountains for 15 years. That's not how people stand when they're hunting. That night, I woke up to the sound of our camp perimeter alarm going off. Mike had set up motion sensors around our tents as a precaution against curious bears. The alarm was a soft beeping that was supposed to wake us without scaring off wildlife we might want to observe. I checked my watch. 3:47 a.m. I unzipped my tent quietly and looked around the camp. Our fire had died down to coals, and everything looked normal in the red glow. Jamie was still sleeping next to me. Lisa's tent was zipped shut. Mike was already up, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his lap, scanning the darkness with a handheld spotlight. "You see anything?" I whispered. "Something tripped the north sensor," he replied softly. "But the beam only goes off when something crosses it, and there's nothing out there now." We sat in silence for maybe 10 minutes, listening to the normal night sounds of the forest. Then Mike's spotlight caught something that made my blood freeze. At the edge of the light's range, maybe 50 yards away, a tall figure was standing motionless between 2 pine trees. It was perfectly still, arms at its sides, head tilted too far to the right. "Hey," Mike called out, his voice echoing through the forest. "This is a research site. You need to identify yourself." The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there like a statue. Mike stood up, keeping his spotlight trained on the figure, and took a few steps toward it. "I'm warning you, this is federal land, and you're interfering with official research." The figure turned its head toward us. Not a normal head movement. It rotated too far, too smoothly, like it was on a swivel. Even from 50 yards away, I could see that its face was wrong. The proportions weren't human. Mike raised his rifle. "That's far enough. I'm calling the authorities." The thing, because I knew it wasn't a person, tilted its head the other way, studying us. Then it took a step backward and simply melted into the darkness, not like it walked away or hid behind a tree. It just disappeared. "What the hell was that?" Lisa's voice came from behind me. She'd gotten out of her tent and was standing in the camp holding a flashlight with shaking hands. Mike didn't answer. He kept his spotlight moving back and forth across the tree line for another hour, but we didn't see anything else. When the sun came up, he hiked out to where the figure had been standing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there should have been footprints. There was nothing. No disturbed leaves, no bent grass, no sign that anything had ever been there. Jamie wanted to pack up and leave that morning. "We got our baseline data," he said. "We can write the report from what we already have." But I talked him out of it. This was the most important research project of my career, and we were only halfway through our data collection period. Besides, Mike seemed confident it was probably just someone playing pranks, maybe illegal hunters trying to scare us away from their territory. I regret that decision every day. The second incident happened 4 days later. I was alone at our main monitoring station, about a mile from base camp, downloading data from our sensors. It was mid-afternoon, bright sunlight filtering through the canopy, and I felt completely safe. Jamie and Lisa were checking equipment at stations to the south. Mike was maintaining our camp. The monitoring station was located in a small clearing next to a creek, surrounded by sensors that measured air quality, soil temperature, moisture levels, and wildlife activity. I was sitting on a folding chair with my laptop, transferring data from our instruments, when I became aware of a sound that didn't belong. Breathing. Slow, deep breathing that was too loud and too close. I looked up from my laptop and froze. On the other side of the creek, maybe 30 feet away, something was crouched down behind a fallen tree. I could see the top of its head, pale, hairless, with skin that looked too smooth. It was breathing deliberately, watching me. My radio was in my backpack, 5 feet away. My satellite phone was back at camp. I was completely alone with this thing that wasn't human. I forced myself to stay calm and spoke clearly. "I can see you. I know you're there. What do you want?" The breathing stopped. Silence stretched out for maybe 30 seconds. Then, slowly, the thing raised its head above the fallen tree. Its face was a mockery of human features. The right proportions but stretched wrong, like someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory and gotten the details wrong. Its eyes were too large and set too far apart. Its mouth was too wide and curved upward in what might have been intended as a smile but looked more like something had carved a grin into its face. It studied me for a long moment, tilting its head back and forth like a curious dog. Then it raised one arm and waved at me. A slow, deliberate wave, like it was copying human behavior it had observed. I grabbed my backpack and radio and ran. I ran through the forest, stumbling over roots and crashing through underbrush, keying my radio and screaming for Jamie and Mike. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed next to a tree, gasping for breath. Jamie's voice crackled over the radio. "Sarah, where are you? What's wrong?" I tried to explain, but the words sounded crazy even to me. A thing with a human face that wasn't quite right. Something that watched and copied and smiled wrong. When I finally made it back to camp an hour later, shaking and exhausted, I could see in their eyes that they thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Mike went back to the monitoring station with Jamie the next morning. They found my laptop and equipment exactly where I'd left them. No footprints on the other side of the creek. No disturbance in the vegetation. No sign that anything had ever been there. "Stress reaction," Jamie said gently. "You've been working too hard, not getting enough sleep. It happens to everyone in isolated field conditions." But I knew what I'd seen. And that night, when I woke up to use the bathroom, I looked toward the tree line and saw at least 6 figures standing motionless in the darkness, watching our camp. I shook Jamie awake, but by the time he got his flashlight, they were gone. The third incident broke me completely. Lisa disappeared on day 21. She'd gone to check the monitoring stations on the east side of our study area, a routine hike she'd done dozens of times before. She had her radio, her GPS, emergency supplies, and she was supposed to be back by sunset. When she didn't return, Mike and Jamie went looking for her. They found her equipment scattered along the trail about 2 miles from camp. Her radio smashed to pieces. Her GPS unit destroyed. Her backpack torn open with everything spilled across the ground. But no signs of a struggle. No blood. No footprints except hers, stopping abruptly next to a large oak tree. We spent the next 3 days searching. Mike was a professional tracker with military experience, and he covered every inch of forest in a 5-mile radius. Jamie and I called her name until our voices gave out. We contacted the Park Service, and they sent in a search and rescue team with dogs. Nothing. Lisa Rodriguez had simply vanished. On the fourth day after she disappeared, I was sitting alone in camp while Jamie and Mike were out with the search team, and I heard her voice calling my name from the forest. "Sarah, Sarah, I'm over here." I grabbed my radio and ran toward you. The sound, following Lisa's voice as it called my name over and over again. It was definitely her voice. I'd worked with her for 8 months. I knew how she sounded when she was scared or excited or tired. "Lisa, where are you? Keep calling. I'm coming." Her voice led me deeper into the forest, always just ahead, always just out of sight. I followed for maybe 20 minutes, crashing through underbrush, calling her name and getting responses that seemed to come from different directions. Then I stumbled into a small clearing, and Lisa was there. She was standing with her back to me, about 30 feet away, wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing when she disappeared. She looked perfectly normal, perfectly unharmed. "Lisa, thank God, are you okay? Where have you been?" She didn't turn around. She just stood there, motionless, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Lisa?" She turned around slowly, and I saw her face. It wasn't Lisa. It was something wearing Lisa's appearance, like a mask that didn't fit quite right. Her features were in the wrong proportions. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide, skin too smooth. But it was unmistakably meant to be Lisa, like something had tried to copy her from a photograph and gotten the details wrong. The thing wearing Lisa's face smiled at me with Lisa's mouth, but the expression was all wrong. Too wide, too knowing, like it was enjoying a joke I didn't understand. "Hello, Sarah," it said in Lisa's voice. "I've been waiting for you." I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the forest with tree branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear Lisa's voice calling my name, but the sound was wrong now. Too loud, echoing from multiple directions at once, like there were several of her calling out. I made it back to camp and collapsed, sobbing and shaking. When Jamie and Mike returned with the search team, I tried to explain what had happened, but I sounded insane. A thing that looked like Lisa, but wasn't Lisa. Something that had copied her appearance, but gotten the proportions wrong. The search team leader, a grizzled park ranger named Tom Bradley, listened to my story with professional patience. Then he took Jamie aside and spoke to him in low tones. I heard the words, psychological break, isolation syndrome, and immediate evacuation. That night was our last night in the forest. We were scheduled for helicopter pickup at dawn. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about Lisa calling my name, couldn't get the image of that wrong-faced thing out of my head. Around 2 a.m., I heard voices outside our tent. Familiar voices. Jamie's voice, Mike's voice, and Lisa's voice, having a normal conversation about breaking down equipment and packing our gear. I could hear them clearly, maybe 20 feet from our tent. But Jamie was sleeping next to me. I could hear his breathing, feel the warmth of his body. And Mike was in his sleeping bag by the fire. I could see the outline of his body through our tent wall. The voices continued talking, discussing our research data and plans for the trip home. Lisa's voice was there, clear and normal, talking about wanting to see her family again. I unzipped our tent door quietly and looked out at the camp. Jamie and Mike were both asleep exactly where they should be. The voices were coming from the darkness beyond our firelight, but there was nothing there. The conversation outside continued for maybe 20 minutes, 3 voices discussing mundane details about our work and our lives. Then I heard Lisa's voice say, "We should check on Sarah. Make sure she's okay." Footsteps started moving toward our tent. I could hear them clearly in the gravel and dead leaves around our camp. I shook Jamie awake frantically. "Jamie, wake up! Something's wrong!" He sat up, groggy and confused. What's happening?" The voices stopped immediately. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell over the forest like a blanket. Jamie listened for a moment, then looked at me with concern. "Sarah, there's nothing there. You're having another episode." But I knew what I'd heard. Something out there was using our voices, copying our conversations, learning how to be us. The helicopter picked us up at dawn. As we lifted off, I looked down at our campsite and saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the tree line watching us leave. 3 tall, thin figures with pale faces tilted up toward the helicopter. Even from 100 feet up, I could see they were trying to wave goodbye, copying human gestures but getting them slightly wrong. The official report stated that Lisa Rodriguez had suffered a fatal accident during routine field research, with her body lost due to difficult terrain and wildlife activity. The other team members had experienced severe psychological stress due to isolation and the trauma of losing a colleague. Dr. Sarah Chen was diagnosed with acute stress reaction and recommended for immediate psychiatric evaluation. I never went back to field research. I couldn't handle being alone in wilderness areas, couldn't sleep in tents, couldn't tolerate the sounds of forests at night. Jamie and I broke up 6 months later. He thought I needed professional help that I refused to get. He was probably right, but the help I needed wasn't for mental illness. It was for knowing that something in those mountains was still out there, still watching, still learning how to be human by copying the people it studied. Mike Patterson died 2 years later. Officially, it was a heart attack during a solo hiking trip in the Smoky Mountains. But the park rangers who found his body said he was discovered sitting upright against a tree, eyes open, facing the trail like he was waiting for someone. No signs of medical distress, no indication of what had killed him. Just dead, sitting peacefully in the forest he'd loved his whole life. I still get emails sometimes. Messages from Lisa's account, sent from wilderness areas with no cell towers or internet access. The messages are always the same. "Sarah, I'm doing fine. The research is going well. When are you coming back to visit?" I never reply. I've changed my email address 4 times, but the messages keep finding me. Lisa's face in the sender photo always looks exactly right in the thumbnail, but when I click on it, the proportions are slightly wrong. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide, smile too knowing. I live in the city now, where there are always people around and always lights on. I check my locks 6 times before bed and sleep with every light in my apartment burning. Because I know what's still out there in the mountains, studying us, learning from us, trying to understand what it means to be human. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I swear I can hear Lisa's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. She sounds happy, excited, like she's discovered something wonderful and wants to share it with me. She wants me to come back to the forest. She says the research is almost complete. I never will. But the thing is, I'm starting to forget what Lisa actually looked like. When I try to picture her face, all I can remember is that wrong version, that almost human mockery I saw in the clearing. Her real face is fading from my memory, being replaced by the copy that something made of her. Sometimes I wonder if the thing in the forest is better at being Lisa Rodriguez than Lisa Rodriguez ever was. If it's learned to improve on the original, to be a more perfect version of her than she could be herself. And sometimes, when I'm feeling my loneliest, I wonder what it would be like to go back, to let it study me, learn from me, make a better copy of Sarah Chen than I could ever be on my own. The emails keep coming. Lisa keeps calling my name. And every night, I check my locks 6 times and try not to listen. But I'm getting tired of being afraid. And the forest is calling me home. I'm 34 years old, and I teach high school math in Atlanta. Last spring, I finally got the promotion I'd been working toward for 8 years. Department head with a decent pay raise that meant we could stop worrying about every grocery bill. My husband David thought we should celebrate properly for once. He's a construction foreman, practical guy who doesn't usually go for big gestures, but he surprised me with a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. Said we deserved a real family vacation after all the stress we'd been through. Our kids, Sophia, who's 12, and Miguel, who's 9, were more excited than I'd seen them in months. We'd been so focused on just getting by that we'd forgotten what it felt like to actually look forward to something. David borrowed his brother's RV and went a little overboard buying camping gear. The kids spent weeks planning hiking routes and campfire games, making lists of everything they wanted to do. I remember thinking this was exactly what we needed. Time together without work calls or homework stress, or bills spread across the kitchen table. For the first time in years, we felt like we could breathe. The promotion meant stability, meant I could stop checking our bank balance every morning, meant the kids could join school clubs without us having to calculate if we could afford the fees. We drove up on a Friday in April, when the dogwoods were blooming and the weather was perfect. Elkmont Campground, Site 47. It's a beautiful area, well maintained, with other families scattered around doing exactly what we were doing, trying to reconnect and enjoy being together. David got the RV set up while I helped the kids claim their spots and organize their hiking packs. Sophia had brought her camera to document everything, and Miguel kept running between campsites making friends with other kids. That first evening was everything I'd hoped for. The kids played capture the flag with a group of families until it got dark, while David and I actually sat down and relaxed for the first time in months. We grilled steaks on the camp stove and opened a bottle of wine to toast my promotion. Nothing fancy, but it felt like luxury after years of stretching every dollar. The kids roasted marshmallows and told us about their new friends, and David shared some ridiculous stories from his construction sites that had us all laughing until our sides hurt. The campfire conversations that night were exactly what family time should be. Sophia showed us pictures she'd taken during the day, and Miguel demonstrated the weird handshake one of the other kids had taught him. We stayed up later than usual, just enjoying the feeling of being content. No phones buzzing with work emergencies, no homework arguments, no discussions about what we couldn't afford. Just our family, finally able to enjoy each other's company without any underlying stress. We slept better that night than we had in months. The RV was comfortable, and there's something about mountain air that makes you sleep deep. Even David, who usually tosses and turns worrying about the next day's job, slept soundly. I woke up Saturday morning feeling genuinely rested for the first time in ages. Saturday morning started perfect too. The kids were up early, excited about our planned hike to Laurel Falls, a 2.6-mile family-friendly trail that several other campers had recommended. David made his famous camp pancakes on the portable stove while I helped the kids pack snacks and water bottles. Everyone was in great spirits, looking forward to a full day of exploring together. We started the hike around 9 in the morning. The trail was well marked and popular, with other families and couples heading in both directions. Sophia and Miguel ran ahead, then doubled back to show us interesting rocks or wildflowers they'd found. They were like completely different kids from the stressed, worried children they'd been back home when money was tight. Miguel kept asking David questions about how waterfalls work, and Sophia was taking pictures of everything, determined to document our first real family vacation. The trail to Laurel Falls has several scenic overlooks where we stopped for photos. Looking at those pictures now, we all look genuinely happy and relaxed. David and I actually look like we're enjoying ourselves instead of just managing crisis after crisis. The kids are goofy and carefree in ways I'd forgotten they could be. We were creating exactly the kind of memories I'd always wanted to give them. At the waterfall, we found a good spot for lunch and spread out our picnic blanket. Other families were doing the same thing, kids playing in the shallow pools while parents watched and chatted. It was exactly the kind of normal, wholesome family experience we'd been too stressed and broke to have before. The kids waded carefully in the water while David and I sat on the rocks, actually able to have a conversation without discussing bills or work problems. Around 3 in the afternoon, we started back toward the campground. The kids were tired but happy, already talking about the cave tour we'd planned for Sunday and asking if we could do more camping trips now that money wasn't so tight. It was the kind of tired that comes from a good day well spent, not the exhausted stress we were all used to. That's when David made what he thought was a smart decision. Instead of taking the main trail back, he suggested a shortcut he'd noticed on the trail map that looked like it would cut about half a mile off our return hike. The GPS on his phone showed we were heading in the right direction, and the kids didn't complain about trying a different route. We'd been walking for about 45 minutes when I started to notice we weren't seeing the trail markers anymore. "Honey, are you sure this is right?" I asked David, looking around for the familiar brown trail signs. "I haven't seen a marker in a while." David checked his phone again. "GPS says we're going the right way, should connect back to the main trail in another 10 minutes or so." But 15 minutes later, we still hadn't found any official trail markers, and we weren't seeing any other hikers either. The path we were on was narrower, less maintained, with branches hanging lower and roots making the walking more difficult. Sophia started taking fewer pictures, and Miguel moved closer to us instead of running ahead. "Dad, how much farther?" Miguel asked, and I could hear the first hint of worry in his voice. "Not much longer, buddy," David said, but I noticed he was checking his phone more frequently. That's when we heard something large moving through the woods behind us. It wasn't the random crashing you'd expect from a deer or even a bear. This sounded deliberate, like something was pushing through the underbrush with purpose, keeping pace with us. David stopped walking and held up his hand for us to be quiet. We stood there listening for maybe 30 seconds, and whatever was back there stopped too. "Probably just another hiker," David said, but his voice had changed. "Let's keep moving." As soon as we started walking again, the sounds resumed. Same distance, same pace, like whatever was back there was matching our speed exactly. I grabbed Sophia's hand and moved Miguel between David and me. The happy family energy from earlier was completely gone, replaced by something that made my stomach clench. "Hello," David called over his shoulder. "We're a little lost. Can you help us find the main trail?" No response, but the movement continued, staying about 50 yards behind us, never getting closer, never falling back. "Mom, I don't like this," Sophia whispered, squeezing my hand. I didn't like it either. Whatever was following us wasn't trying to catch up or help. It was just following, like it was watching us, studying how we moved as a family. David tried his phone again, still showing we were headed in the right direction, but I was starting to realize that didn't mean much if we weren't on an actual trail anymore. The path we were on seemed to be leading us deeper into the woods, away from the sounds of other people, away from the maintained areas of the park. For the next hour, our family celebration became something else entirely. Whatever was following us was smart. It kept us moving in a specific direction, using the terrain to funnel us toward lower ground where the trees were thicker and the paths more confusing. Every time David tried to change direction or head uphill toward what might be a main trail, we'd hear movement from that direction too, like we were being herded. The kids were scared now, really scared, in a way that broke my heart. Miguel was crying quietly, and Sophia kept looking back even though I told her not to. David was carrying Miguel most of the time now, and I could see the stress and exhaustion wearing on him. But whatever was tracking us never seemed to tire, never fell behind, never lost interest. Around 5 o'clock, David realized what was happening. We were being driven toward a dead-end canyon with steep walls on 3 sides. No way out except back the way we'd come, and that's where our stalker was waiting. "Listen to me," David said quietly, setting Miguel down and pulling us all close. "I want you 3 to hide behind those big rocks over there. Don't come out no matter what you hear, and don't make any noise. I'm going back to deal with whoever this is." "David, no," I started, but he was already handing me his backpack. "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, try to climb out of here. Follow the canyon wall north until you find a way up." He kissed all of us quickly and walked back up the trail, leaving us pressed together behind a boulder, listening. I had my arms around both kids, trying to keep them calm while my heart hammered against my ribs. The sounds that came from up the trail weren't what I expected. David was shouting, but not words, more like warnings or challenges. Then we heard branches breaking, rocks falling, sounds of a struggle that seemed to go on forever. There were impacts and grunts that could have been David, but other noises too. Sounds I couldn't identify, sounds that didn't seem quite human. When David came back, his shirt was torn and bloody. He had deep scratches on his arms and what looked like bite marks on his shoulder. His face was pale and his hands were shaking, but he was walking on his own. "We have to go. Right now," was all he said. He helped us climb out of the canyon while he was still functional. The kids helped each other, and we worked as a team, but I could see David was hurting worse than he was letting on. The wounds on his arms looked like they came from claws, and the bite marks were deep enough that I was worried about infection. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with just one stalker anymore. From 3 different positions around the canyon, we heard voices calling to each other. Not words exactly, but communication, coordinated signals that meant we were surrounded by multiple things. Whatever David had fought, it had called for help. The sun was setting, and as the light faded, they got bolder. We could hear them moving closer, making more noise, working together like a pack. David found us a shallow cave and used rocks to partially block the entrance, but his left arm wasn't working properly, and he was losing blood. "Dad, you need a doctor," Sophia said, and she was right. But there were no doctors out here, and no way to call for help. Full dark came around 7:30, and that's when they attacked the cave. I can't describe exactly what tried to get to us that night, because honestly, I couldn't see them clearly. But there were multiple figures, working together to tear away the rocks David had piled up. They had long arms that reached into the cave, trying to grab us, and they were strong, moving stones that should have been too heavy for one person to handle. David fought them at the entrance with his camping knife and anything else he could grab, while the kids and I screamed from the back of the cave. I've never seen anyone fight like that. Not for himself, but for his family, using everything he had left to protect us. It went on for hours. They'd attack, David would drive them back, then they'd regroup and try again. I don't know how he kept it up with his injuries, but somehow he did. Sophia and Miguel stayed pressed against me at the back of the cave, and I tried to cover their ears so they wouldn't hear the worst of it. The park rangers found us at first light, following the sounds of our screams that had been echoing through the canyon all night. David was unconscious by then, and the kids and I were in shock. The rangers called for a helicopter and airlifted David to the trauma center in Knoxville while the rest of us were taken to the local hospital. David survived, but with permanent nerve damage in his left arm that ended his construction career. The doctors said the bite marks showed signs of infection from bacteria they couldn't identify, and the claw marks required over 200 stitches. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital and has never told us exactly what he fought that night. The Park Service investigation found evidence of the struggle: blood, torn clothing, disturbed ground, but no trace of who or what attacked us. No footprints they could identify, no DNA evidence, nothing that would help them understand what happened to our family in that canyon. Officially, they blamed aggressive local wildlife, possibly rabid bears or wild boars defending their territory. The incident report mentioned that we'd been off marked trails and suggested that we'd encountered animals that felt cornered or threatened. They recommended better trail signage and more ranger patrols, but no one ever acknowledged what we actually experienced. Sophia and Miguel needed months of therapy. They won't go outdoors after dark anymore, and they're terrified of anyone approaching the house unexpectedly. Sophia stopped taking pictures, and Miguel has trouble sleeping alone. The joy and security they felt during that first day of our vacation was completely destroyed. We moved from our rural area outside Atlanta to a suburban neighborhood with streetlights and close neighbors. David had to find different work he could do with his injured arm, and I had to take on extra tutoring to make up for his lost income. The promotion I'd been so excited to celebrate became just another source of stress as our medical bills piled up. We can't enjoy camping, hiking, or any outdoor activities anymore. The kids associate wilderness with terror now, and David gets anxious any time we drive through heavily wooded areas. That perfect family moment we'd been celebrating was destroyed by something that hunted us for sport. I've since learned that other families have reported similar stalking experiences in the Smokies, always involving groups being herded away from main trails by coordinated attackers. The Park Service doesn't publicize these incidents because they devastate tourism, but if you ask the right rangers quietly, they'll admit there's a pattern. Whatever lives in those mountains targets families specifically. They study family dynamics, separate the strong from the weak, and use intelligence and coordination that no animal should possess. They hunt humans the way we might hunt deer, patiently, professionally, with clear strategy and purpose. David checks every door and window in our house twice before bed, and sometimes I catch him staring out at the tree line behind our neighborhood like he's watching for something. He won't talk about what he actually saw and fought that night, but his behavior tells me it was worse than wild animals defending territory. Looking back now, I understand that our promotion celebration made us a perfect target. We were a happy, close-knit family group, isolated in unfamiliar territory, with children that would make adults fight desperately to protect them. Whatever hunts in those mountains wanted to destroy what we loved most, and they nearly succeeded. We survived physically, but we lost the joy and security that made us want to celebrate in the first place. David's career, the kids' sense of safety, our ability to enjoy simple family activities, all destroyed by encountering pure predators that hunt human families for sport. I still teach math, and David found work he can do with his limitations, but we're not the same family that drove excitedly to the mountains that Friday. The Appalachian wilderness taught us that happiness makes you vulnerable, that family bonds can be used against you, and that some evil doesn't want to recruit you or convert you to anything. It just wants to hunt you down and destroy everything you care about, because it can. I'm 26 years old, and I deliver pizzas in Baltimore for a living. Not exactly the career I planned when I graduated college, but student loans don't care about your dreams, you know? By last October, I was working 6 days a week, living in a studio apartment that cost more than my parents' first mortgage, and I hadn't had a real day off in about 4 months. My manager kept scheduling me for doubles. My car was making this grinding noise I couldn't afford to fix. And honestly, I was starting to feel like I was disappearing into the city noise. My dad used to take me camping when I was a kid, back before he got too busy with work and I got too busy with video games. I remembered how quiet it was out there in the woods, how you could actually hear yourself think. So when I found myself scrolling through hiking websites at 2 a.m. instead of sleeping, I figured maybe it was time to try something different. I'd never done solo backpacking before, but how hard could it be? YouTube has tutorials for everything, right? That's how I ended up researching Dolly Sod's Wilderness in West Virginia. 17,000 acres of backcountry, remote enough that you could go days without seeing another person. It looked perfect for what I needed. Complete disconnection from everything that was making me feel crazy. I spent my last paycheck at REI buying a tent, sleeping bag, backpack, all the gear the saleswoman said I'd need. Watched probably 20 hours of camping tutorials, memorized leave no trace principles, studied topographic maps until I could navigate them in my sleep. The drive down from Baltimore took about 4 hours. I left early on a Thursday morning in mid-October, when the fall colors were supposed to be at their peak. The deeper I got into West Virginia, the more the landscape opened up. Rolling hills covered in red and gold, old farmhouses tucked into valleys, the kind of scenery that makes you understand why people used to write songs about country roads. My phone lost signal about an hour before I reached the trailhead, which honestly felt like a relief. The parking area was just a small gravel lot beside Forest Service Road 75, with a wooden sign marking the Dolly Sod's North Trailhead. There were only 2 other cars there, both with out-of-state plates, and I didn't see their owners anywhere. I loaded up my pack, checked my map one more time, and started hiking around 2 p.m. The trail was well marked with blue blazes, winding through dense forest that smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke from someone's distant campfire. It felt good to be carrying everything I needed on my back. For the first time in months, I wasn't worried about traffic or delivery times or whether my manager was going to call me in on my day off. Just one foot in front of the other, breathing air that actually felt clean in my lungs. The trail was moderate difficulty, mostly gradual climbs with occasional steep sections that got my heart pumping. I passed a few day hikers heading back to their cars, everyone friendly and offering trail conditions updates. I reached my planned campsite around 6 p.m., just as the sun was starting to sink behind the ridgeline. It was a designated spot marked on my map, a small clearing maybe 50 yards off the main trail, with level ground and a stream running nearby. Perfect for a first solo camping experience. I pitched my tent following the YouTube instructions, set up my camp stove on a flat rock, filtered water from the stream using my new purification system. Everything was working exactly like it was supposed to. Made myself a dinner of dehydrated beef stroganoff, which actually tasted pretty good when you're hungry from hiking all day, and built a small campfire with fallen branches. Sat there watching the flames dance while the forest settled into its evening routine. Owls calling back and forth across the valley, small animals rustling through the underbrush, wind moving through the trees with that sound like distant conversation. I felt more relaxed than I had in years. My phone was completely dead for signal, but the GPS still worked sporadically when I held it up toward the sky. I'd downloaded offline maps before leaving Baltimore, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. It was actually nice being unreachable for once. No texts from work, no social media notifications, no news alerts telling me about things I couldn't control anyway. Just me and the wilderness, exactly like I'd imagined. I fell asleep easily that first night, listening to the stream and the normal sounds of a healthy forest. Slept better than I had in months, woke up naturally around 7 a.m. feeling more rested than I could remember. Made camp coffee on my little stove, ate granola bars and dried fruit for breakfast. Planned out a day hike to a scenic overlook I'd marked on my map. Everything was going perfectly. Left my base camp around 9 a.m. with just a day pack. Water, snacks, first aid kit, map and compass. The trail to the overlook was about 4 miles round trip, winding through some beautiful terrain. Mixed hardwood forest giving way to open meadows, rocky outcroppings with views across the valley, patches of mountain laurel still holding on to their late-season blooms. Took my time, stopped to take pictures, ate lunch sitting on a boulder overlooking miles of unbroken wilderness. I felt like a real outdoorsman up there, like I'd figured something out that most people never bother to learn. This was what I'd been missing, stuck in the city delivering pizzas to people too busy to cook for themselves. Out here, everything made sense. Simple problems with simple solutions. Get tired, rest. Get hungry, eat. Get cold, build a fire. No customer complaints, no traffic jams, no rent payments. Started back toward camp around 3 p.m., plenty of daylight left. The trail was clear and well marked, impossible to get lost. I was already planning my next backpacking trip, maybe somewhere in Virginia or Tennessee. This solo camping thing was definitely going to become a regular part of my life. But when I got back to my campsite, something was wrong. My tent had been moved. Not damaged, not torn, or anything like that. All the zippers were still closed. My gear was still inside. Nothing was missing. But the tent was definitely in a different spot. I'd pitched it on the north side of the clearing, about 10 feet from the stream. Now it was on the south side, maybe 15 feet from where I'd left it. I stood there staring at it for probably 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The tent was set up exactly the same way. Guy lines tight, rainfly properly positioned, stakes driven in at the right angles. Someone had taken the time to move it carefully, professionally. But who? And why? I walked the perimeter of the clearing looking for signs of other campers. Didn't find any tire tracks, footprints, gear, or fire rings I hadn't made. The 2 cars at the trailhead had been day hikers, probably long gone by now, and even if someone else had hiked in, why would they move my tent without leaving a note or trying to find me? It didn't make any sense. Must have been an animal, I decided. Maybe a bear or deer had bumped into the tent while investigating the camp, somehow dragged or pushed it across the clearing. That was the only logical explanation. I moved the tent back to its original position, made sure all the stakes were driven in deep, hung my food bag higher in the tree. Problem solved. Made dinner, built another campfire, tried to enjoy the evening. But I kept feeling like someone was watching me. Every time I looked up from the fire, I expected to see another hiker standing at the edge of the clearing. The normal forest sounds seemed louder somehow, and I found myself turning my head every time a branch creaked or leaves rustled. Around midnight, I woke up to find someone had built a cairn next to my fire ring. A perfect stack of 3 flat stones, balanced carefully on top of each other, with a strip of bright red cloth tied around the top stone. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I was sure of that. I'd spent 20 minutes banking the coals properly, looking all around the fire area to make sure everything was safe. There had been no rock pile. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, shining my headlamp on the cairn. The stones looked local, flat pieces of sandstone probably picked up from the stream bed. But the red cloth was strange. It was fresh, bright-colored, looked like it had been recently cut from something larger, like a flag or bandana. Who would hike into the wilderness just to mark random campsites with rock piles? Maybe it was some kind of trail marking system I didn't know about. Backcountry hikers using cairns to mark good campsites or water sources for other backpackers. The red cloth could be a signal, maybe indicating that the site was occupied or safe or had good water access. That made sense. I was still new to this whole wilderness culture thing, but lying in my tent for the next few hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing right outside while I slept, had walked right up to my campfire, spent time carefully balancing those stones, tied that cloth in place, all while I was unconscious just a few feet away. The idea made my skin crawl. I barely slept the rest of that night, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and jumpy, but the daylight made everything seem normal again. The cairn was still there, looking innocent in the sunlight. Just rocks and cloth, nothing threatening about it. After breakfast, I decided to hike out a different trail, explore another part of the wilderness area, maybe find some other campers to ask about the rock pile tradition. But when I got back to camp that evening, 3 more cairns had appeared while I was gone, all identical to the first one. 3 stones each, perfectly balanced, strips of red cloth tied to the top stones, arranged in a rough line leading from my fire ring toward the tree line on the east side of the clearing, like markers pointing into the woods. Now I was genuinely spooked. 4 rock piles don't just appear by themselves. Someone was definitely messing with me, but I couldn't figure out who or why. I hadn't seen another person since the day hikers at the trailhead 2 days ago. The wilderness was huge, thousands of acres, plenty of space for everyone to camp without bothering each other. Why was someone playing games with my campsite? That night, I barely slept at all. Every hour or so, I'd wake up and listen, trying to catch the sound of footsteps or voices. Around 2 a.m., I heard them. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking in circles around my tent. Not hurried or clumsy like an animal might sound, but measured, purposeful, like someone pacing. The steps would start at the front of my tent, move slowly around to the left side, across the back, up the right side, then back to the front. Over and over, in a perfect circle, about 10 feet out from where I was lying. I held my breath, trying to count the steps. 12 steps per circuit, always the same rhythm. Step, 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 with about 2 seconds between each one. Whoever was out there was taking their time, being deliberate about it. After about 10 minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited, listening to my heart pound, but didn't hear anything else. No voices, no movement, no sounds of someone leaving the area. Just the normal forest sounds, like nothing had happened. In the morning, I found the footprints, clear impressions in the soft mud near the stream, forming a perfect circle around where my tent was pitched. But they weren't right. They were human-shaped, about the size of a man's bare feet, but they only had 4 toes each. The big toe was in the right place, but the other 3 toes were too long and evenly spaced, and the heel was wrong too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the back edge. I crouched down and studied them carefully, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, definitely made sometime during the night. But no human has feet like that, and no animal I knew of would leave prints that were so similar to human feet, but with those specific differences. I followed the circle of tracks, counting them. 48 prints total, forming a perfect ring around my campsite. Each print was identical, pressed into the mud with the same pressure, the same depth. Whatever had made them had been walking slowly, deliberately, studying my camp from every angle. The worst part was finding the handprint on the outside of my tent. It was pressed into the nylon near the foot of my sleeping bag, like something had reached down and touched the tent wall while I was sleeping inside. The print was human-like but wrong in the same way as the footprints. 4 fingers instead of 5, the thumb too long and placed at the wrong angle. And it was greasy, leaving an oily residue that smelled like battery acid mixed with something rotten. That's when I started packing up to leave. I'd planned to stay another 2 nights, but this was getting way too weird for me. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to stick around to see how it escalated. I broke camp quickly, stuffed everything into my pack without bothering to organize it properly. Just wanted to get back to the trailhead and my car as fast as possible. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed that my entire campsite had been rearranged again. Not just moved this time, organized. My camp stove was placed exactly in the center of where my tent had been pitched. My water bottles were arranged in a straight line pointing toward the tree line. My camp chair was positioned facing east, toward the trail I'd hiked the day before. Even my trash bag was carefully folded and placed on a flat rock like some kind of offering. It was like someone had studied how I organized my gear and then improved on it. Created a more efficient, more geometrically perfect version of my campsite. The kind of arrangement someone might make if they understood the function of each item, but not the human reasons behind how they'd been placed. I found 7 more cairns that morning, arranged in a perfect circle around the clearing, each one identical to the others. 3 balanced stones with red cloth tied to the top. But the cloth strips were longer now, and they moved in the breeze like prayer flags, or like boundary markers. The smell was getting stronger too. That sharp chemical odor I'd noticed on the handprint was now permeating the entire campsite. It got more intense near each of the cairns, like the red cloth had been soaked in whatever was producing the smell. Made my eyes water and gave me a headache if I got too close. I started hiking out around noon, following the blue blazes back toward the trailhead. But something was wrong with the trail. Sections that had been clear and well marked on my hike-in were now confusing, with blazes that seemed to point in different directions. I found myself turned around several times, ending up at dead ends or game trails that weren't on my map. My GPS was acting up too, showing me in locations that didn't match the topography around me. According to the device, I was sometimes half a mile from where the trail obviously was, sometimes showing me inside solid rock formations. The altitude readings kept changing, even when I was walking on level ground. By late afternoon, I was getting seriously worried. I'd been hiking for hours, but didn't feel like I was making any real progress toward the trailhead. The forest looked the same in every direction. Dense hardwoods with occasional clearings, rocky outcroppings, small streams. I couldn't find any of the landmarks I'd noted on my hike-in. That's when I heard my own voice calling from the woods. "Jake, Jake, over here." Perfect imitation of my voice coming from somewhere ahead and to the left of the trail. But I was alone. Had been alone for 3 days. There was no one else out there who even knew my name. "Jake, I found the way out." Same voice, same inflection I might use if I was excited about something. But the timing was wrong. The words echoed slightly, like someone playing a recording in an empty room. And there was no warmth in it, no personality, just the technical accuracy of the sounds my voice makes without any of the things that make it actually mine. I stood frozen on the trail, trying to decide what to do. Following voices in the wilderness is exactly the kind of mistake that gets people lost forever. But the voice sounded so much like me that for a moment I wondered if I was having some kind of breakdown, calling out to myself without realizing it. "Jake, this way." Definitely coming from off the trail now, deeper into the woods where the undergrowth was thick and there were no blazes to follow. I stayed on the marked path, but I could hear the voice moving parallel to me as I hiked, always staying just out of sight in the trees. It kept calling for about an hour, sometimes from the left side of the trail, sometimes from the right. Always my voice, always using my name, but with phrases I would never actually say. "Jake, come see this. Jake, you need to come here. Jake, I'm waiting for you." Just before sunset, I saw it. A tall, pale figure standing between two trees about 50 yards ahead of me on the trail. At first glance, it looked human, roughly the right height and proportions, standing upright like a person. But the more I stared at it, the more wrong it became. The head was tilted at an angle that would be impossible for a human neck. Not just turned to the side, but canted at maybe 45 degrees, like someone had grabbed the skull and twisted it partway around. The arms were too long, hanging down past where the knees should be, and it was perfectly still, not breathing or shifting weight or making any of the small movements that living things make. When I stopped walking, it disappeared. Not like it had moved or hidden behind a tree, but like it had never been there at all. 1 second I was looking at this figure on the trail ahead of me. The next second, I was staring at empty forest. I waited for maybe 10 minutes, watching the spot where it had been, but nothing moved. Finally worked up the courage to hike forward and check the area. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been standing there. But the chemical smell was stronger, hanging in the air like invisible smoke. That night I didn't even try to set up camp, just kept hiking by headlamp, following the blue blazes when I could find them, bushwhacking through the forest when the trail seemed to disappear. I was beyond tired, running on adrenaline and the desperate need to get back to my car. Around midnight, I found my original campsite again. I'd been hiking away from it for hours, following what I thought was the trail back to the trailhead. But somehow I'd ended up right back where I started, standing in the clearing where I'd spent the last 3 nights. The cairns were still there, the red cloth strips moving in the breeze. My campfire ring, the flat rock where I'd set up my stove, the tree where I'd hung my food bag. But now there were improvements. Someone had diverted the stream so it flowed right past the clearing, creating a small pool that would be perfect for collecting water. The ground had been cleared and leveled, removing rocks and roots to create a more comfortable sleeping area. A natural windbreak had been built using fallen logs, positioned to block the prevailing wind from the north. And there was food waiting for me. Fresh fish cleaned and laid out on flat rocks near the stream. Wild berries arranged in neat piles on broad leaves. Edible plants that I recognized from my wilderness survival research. Roots and greens that would provide good nutrition for someone camping long-term. It was like someone had taken my basic campsite and turned it into a permanent wilderness home. Everything I'd need to live comfortably in the woods for weeks or months. Water, shelter, food, protection from the elements. A perfect outdoor living situation that would be almost impossible to leave voluntarily. That's when I realized what was happening. Something was studying me, learning my camping patterns, my preferences, my needs. It had watched how I organized my gear, what foods I ate, how I positioned my tent relative to water and wind. And now it was trying to improve my experience, make the wilderness so comfortable and convenient that I'd want to stay, permanently. The voice mimicry, the territorial marking with the cairns, the landscape modifications. It was all designed to integrate me into this place, make me part of whatever ecosystem existed here. I wasn't being hunted or threatened. I was being domesticated. I started walking again, but this time I ignored the trails completely. Bushwhacked straight through the forest in what I hoped was the general direction of the parking area. Used my compass and dead reckoning, navigating by stars when I could see them through the canopy. The thing followed me. I could hear it moving parallel to my route, staying just out of sight, but making enough noise that I'd know it was there. Sometimes it would call out in my voice, trying to get me to change direction. "Jake, the trail's over here. Jake, you're going the wrong way." But I ignored it and kept pushing through the underbrush. Around 3 a.m., I broke through the tree line into the parking area. My car was still there, covered in dew but untouched. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, threw my pack in the trunk, started the engine. As I was backing out of the parking space, I saw the thing standing at the edge of the forest, tall and pale in my headlights, with that unnaturally tilted head and arms that hung too long. It didn't move or try to follow me, just watched as I drove away. But even from a distance, I could tell it was disappointed, like I'd failed some kind of test or refused an invitation it had worked hard to prepare. The drive back to Baltimore took 6 hours instead of 4 because I had to stop twice to throw up from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in my headlights, head tilted at that impossible angle. It took months to readjust to city life after that. I kept feeling like I should be outside, sleeping under stars, drinking water from streams, eating food that I'd found or caught myself. My apartment felt cramped and artificial. Delivering pizzas felt meaningless after experiencing that kind of self-sufficiency in the wilderness. Part of me wanted to go back, still does, if I'm being honest. There was something appealing about the life that thing was offering. No bills, no job stress, no traffic or noise or deadlines, just existence in a place designed specifically for my comfort and needs. A personalized wilderness paradise with a caretaker that had studied exactly what would make me happy. But I know what the price would be. That thing doesn't want to hurt people. It wants to keep them, make them so comfortable in its territory that leaving becomes impossible. Perfect wilderness. Hospitality that turns into permanent residence. I never went back to Dolly Sods, and I never will. But sometimes late at night when I'm stuck in traffic or dealing with difficult customers, I think about that improved campsite. The stream that had been diverted to flow past the clearing, the food that appeared every morning, the landscape modifications that made everything more convenient and beautiful. I think about what my life would be like now if I'd accepted that invitation, if I'd let whatever was out there finish the process of integrating me into its domain. And honestly, there are days when I'm not sure I made the right choice, but I know that thing is still out there, maintaining that perfect campsite, waiting for the next solo hiker to claim. And whoever finds that place next might not be strong enough to leave. I was 38 when this happened, about 3 years ago now. I still live in Charleston, West Virginia, still work at the same salon cutting hair, but I don't sleep much anymore. Haven't had a full night's rest since that camping trip. People ask me why Steve and I got divorced so suddenly after 15 years, why we both look like we aged a decade in one summer. I tell them we just grew apart, but that's not the truth. The truth is, some places in these mountains don't want you there. And if you go anyway, if you bring your poison with you into their sacred spaces, they'll show you exactly what kind of people you really are. They'll make you live it. Steve and I used to go to New River Gorge every year for our anniversary. Same campsite, same traditions, same Facebook photos that made everyone think we had this perfect marriage. What they didn't see was Steve starting his day with whiskey in his coffee, or me swallowing 3 anxiety pills before breakfast. What they didn't know was that we were both cheating, both lying, both slowly destroying everything we'd built together. By our 15th anniversary, we could barely stand to be in the same room. But we'd already booked Site 23 at Babcock State Park, and canceling would mean answering questions we weren't ready to face. So we loaded up the car with our camping gear, our secrets, and our mutual hatred, and drove into the mountains one last time. The first night was bad. We fought over dinner, fought over setting up the tent, fought over who forgot to pack the lantern batteries. The family camping next to us, the Hendersons, nice people with 2 young kids, kept giving us these worried looks. By 10 p.m. we were screaming at each other loud enough that Mr. Henderson came over and politely asked us to keep it down. Steve told him to mind his own damn business, and I wanted to disappear into the ground. After Henderson went back to his family, Steve and I sat by our dying fire and said things that can't be taken back. Things about my weight, about his drinking, about the people we'd been with behind each other's backs. Ugly, hateful things. That's when we first heard it. This sound coming from the woods behind our campsite, like crying, but not quite human. High-pitched and desperate, like something in terrible pain. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Steve was drunk enough to think it was funny. Probably just a fox, he slurred, taking another swig from the bottle he'd been hiding in his sleeping bag. But the Henderson kids were whimpering in their tent, and even their dog was whining and trying to hide under their picnic table. The second night, the crying started earlier. Around sunset, while we were choking down burnt hot dogs and avoiding eye contact, that sound drifted out of the forest again. But this time it was closer, and it wasn't alone. There were at least 3 distinct voices, all crying in harmony, all just wrong enough to make your skin crawl. Mrs. Henderson asked if we'd heard anything strange the night before. When we nodded, she got this scared look and said they were thinking about leaving early. Their youngest had been having nightmares about the sad ladies in the woods, and their dog refused to go more than 10 feet from their RV. That night, Steve and I were too focused on our own misery to pay much attention to the crying. He'd been drinking since noon, and I'd taken enough pills to make everything feel soft and distant. We were sitting on opposite sides of the campfire, not talking, when he suddenly looked up at me and said, "You know I can see right through you, don't you?" I thought he meant emotionally, that he could see how much I hated him. But he was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, his eyes wide and terrified. "Karen," he whispered, "I can see the tree behind you, through your body." I looked down at my hands. They looked normal to me, solid and real. But Steve was backing away from the fire, stumbling toward the tent. "What did you do to yourself?" he kept saying. "What did you take? You're disappearing." I told him he was drunk, that he was seeing things. But part of me wondered if the pills were stronger than I'd thought. I'd been taking more and more lately, chasing that numb feeling that made it easier to pretend my marriage wasn't dead. The third night, neither of us could ignore what was happening anymore. We'd spent the day hiking the New River Trail, barely speaking to each other when we got lost. The trail markers we'd followed dozens of times before seemed to be pointing in random directions. Our GPS kept losing signal, Our compass spun like a broken toy, and no matter which path we took, we always ended up back at the same weathered oak tree with something carved into its bark. At first, I thought it was just initials, lovers' names or dates. But when I looked closer, I could see it was words, carved deep into the living wood. Show us what you really are. Steve laughed when I showed him, that bitter, drunk laugh that meant he was about to say something cruel. Well, that's appropriate, he said, since we're both such goddamn liars. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. The Hendersons were packing up their RV, moving with the urgent efficiency of people who'd made a hard decision. Mr. Henderson stopped when he saw us and said, "You folks should consider leaving too. This place, it's not right. Whatever's in those woods, it's getting stronger." Mrs. Henderson was loading their sobbing children into the RV. The youngest kept screaming about the ladies who wanted to play with her, the ladies who looked sick and see-through. Their dog was cowering in the front seat, shaking like it was freezing despite the warm evening. After they drove away, Steve and I were alone in the campground, completely alone, with just our tent and that sound starting up again from the woods behind us. But this time, it wasn't just crying. This time, we could hear words. They were calling our names. Karen, Steve, Karen, Steve. Over and over, in voices that sounded almost like us but wrong, like bad recordings played at the wrong speed. And they were getting closer. Steve grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line. The beam illuminated 3 figures standing just inside the woods, maybe 50 yards away. They looked like women in old-fashioned dresses, but something was off about their proportions. Their arms were too long, their heads tilted at impossible angles, and when the light hit them, I could see right through them to the trees beyond. "Karen, Steve," they called, and started moving toward us with a gliding motion that didn't look like walking. Their feet never seemed to touch the ground. We ran, left everything at the campsite, tent, sleeping bags, cooler, car keys, and just ran blindly into the woods in the opposite direction. Behind us, I could hear those voices getting louder, more excited, like they were enjoying the chase. The forest was wrong. Paths that should have led to the parking area twisted back on themselves. Trees that had been there moments before vanished when we turned around. The darkness seemed to move independently of our flashlight beam, flowing around us like thick liquid. And then we started seeing ourselves. At first it was just glimpses, a flash of Steve's red jacket in the distance, the shape of my backpack moving between the trees. But soon we were encountering full scenes, like 3-dimensional movies playing out in the woods around us. We saw ourselves at home, fighting in our kitchen while Steve drank straight from the bottle and I counted pills into my palm. We saw Steve in a motel room with his coworker Sarah fumbling with her bra while she laughed at something he'd said. We saw me in my car after closing time, letting my client Marcus slide his hand up my thigh while I told myself it didn't count if we didn't go all the way. But the worst part was seeing what we'd become when we thought no one was looking. The faces we made when the other person's back was turned. The pure hatred in our expressions. The way Steve would mime strangling me when I was washing dishes. The way I would look at kitchen knives and imagine what it would feel like to slide one between his ribs. These weren't memories. These were truths we'd never admitted, not even to ourselves. And somehow, this place was forcing us to witness them, to see ourselves as we really were. The figures were still following us, still calling our names, but now there were more of them. Dozens of transparent women in rotting dresses, all reaching toward us with skeletal fingers, all crying in that horrible harmony. We stumbled into a clearing where an old cabin stood, half collapsed and covered in vines. Steve tried the door, and it swung open on rusted hinges. Inside, a lantern sat, on a wooden table, already lit, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, black and white and sepia-toned, showing couples in various states of decay. Some looked like normal wedding photos, but if you looked closely, you could see the hatred in their eyes, the forced smiles that didn't reach their faces. Others showed the same couples years later, drunk, violent, cheating, destroying each other piece by piece. In the corner of each photo was a date and a location. New River Gorge, 1923. New River Gorge, 1945. New River Gorge, 1967. All the way up to recent years, digital photos printed and tacked to the walls with rusty nails. And at the very center of the display was a photo of Steve and me from our first anniversary trip 15 years ago. We looked so young, so genuinely happy, but someone had written across it in what looked like dried blood. Before. Steve grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the wall. The flame spread quickly across the old wood, and we ran again as the cabin began to burn behind us. But the fire followed us. No matter how far we ran, we could see the orange glow through the trees, and the smoke that should have risen straight up was moving like fingers, reaching for us, wrapping around our legs and pulling us back toward the flames. The transparent women were surrounding us now, close enough that I could smell the grave dirt on their clothes and see the maggots crawling through their hair. They weren't crying anymore. They were laughing. One of them spoke, her voice like wind through a broken window. "You brought so much poison here, fed it to each other for so long, made this beautiful place sick with your hatred." Another one said, "Now you get to stay. Join us. Become the truth of what you are." I looked at Steve, really looked at him for the first time in years. His face was gray and sunken, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking, not just from fear, but from the constant need for alcohol. And I knew I looked just as bad, hollow-eyed from the pills, bitter lines around my mouth from years of swallowing angry words. We were already ghosts. We'd been killing each other slowly for years, and this place was just showing us the end result. But right then, in that moment of perfect terror, I made a choice. Instead of running from Steve, instead of blaming him for everything that had gone wrong, I reached for his hand. His skin felt real, solid, warm, human. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and for the first time in years I meant it. The burning stopped. The laughter stopped. The ghostly women froze in place like broken dolls. Steve squeezed my hand and said, "I'm sorry too." The forest around us shuddered, like reality was trying to reset itself. The path home appeared at our feet, clearly marked and well lit by normal moonlight. We walked back to our campsite in silence, still holding hands. Our tent was exactly where we'd left it, as if we'd never run at all. But the photos were gone from the burning cabin. We could see its remains smoldering in the distance, though it hadn't been visible from our campsite before. We packed up in the dark and drove straight home without speaking. But it wasn't the angry silence we'd lived with for years. It was the quiet of two people who'd seen something terrible and somehow survived it together. We got divorced 3 months later, but not out of hatred. We realized that some kinds of damage can't be fixed, that some poisons run too deep to ever be fully cleansed. The marriage was dead, had been dead for years, and trying to keep it alive was what had made us into the kind of people that place wanted to claim. But we're friends now, in a way we never were when we were married. We check on each other, make sure neither of us is slipping back into those dark patterns. Steve's been sober for 2 years. I've been clean for 18 months. Sometimes I wonder about those other couples in the photographs, whether they found a way out or whether they're still trapped in those woods, playing out their hatred for eternity. I think about the Henderson kids and their nightmares about sad ladies who wanted to play. I never went camping again. Neither did Steve. Some places are sacred, and some places are hungry, and New River Gorge is both. It showed us what we were becoming and gave us one chance to choose differently. Most couples don't get that chance. Most couples feed their poison to each other until there's nothing left but ghosts wearing human faces. We were lucky. We saw the truth in time. The women in the woods are still there, still crying, still calling for couples who bring their hatred into sacred spaces, still adding new photographs to the walls of cabins that burn but never quite burn down. If you're planning an anniversary trip to celebrate a love that's already dead, maybe choose somewhere else. Somewhere that won't notice if you're just going through the motions. Somewhere that won't show you what you really are. Because once you've seen it, once you know what you're becoming, you can never pretend again. And that's a mercy most people aren't strong enough to handle. I'm 31 now, and I haven't been camping since I was 22. 9 years feels like a lifetime, but some experiences carve themselves so deep into your bones that time doesn't heal them. It just teaches you to live around the scar tissue. My name's Tyler Brown, and back in 2016, I was a different person entirely. Fresh out of trade school, working part-time at a garage in Louisville, spending most of my free time getting into the kind of trouble that seems harmless when you're young and stupid. That summer, I got arrested for spray painting some abandoned warehouse downtown. Third strike vandalism that should have meant real jail time. But Judge Morrison was feeling generous, or maybe just tired. He gave me a choice: 30 days in county lockup, or community service doing environmental cleanup in Daniel Boone National Forest. Easy decision, right? I'd rather be outside picking up trash than sitting in a cell with guys who'd done worse than spray paint buildings. Looking back, I should have known that easy choices in life usually aren't. The community service program was run through the Kentucky Department of Parks, and they assigned me to a crew of 6 other offenders with similar charges. Kevin Miller, skinny kid my age who'd been shoplifting electronics to feed a gaming addiction. Sarah Chen, 19, caught with fake IDs after her sorority got busted. Marcus Williams, mid-30s guy on his second DUI. Lisa Rodriguez, public intoxication after a messy divorce. And Tommy Fletcher, quiet 18-year-old vandal who reminded me of myself before I'd learned to run my mouth. Our supervisor was Angela Thompson, a park ranger who looked like she could bench press a pickup truck. She had this way of talking that made it clear she'd dealt with our type before. Not harsh exactly, but firm enough that you knew she wouldn't tolerate any bullshit. First day, she gathered us around a picnic table at the main trailhead and explained what we'd be doing. "This isn't punishment," she said, though we all knew better. "This is environmental education. You're here to learn about forest conservation, leave no trace principles, and why these wilderness areas matter to our ecosystem." She paused, looking each of us in the eye. Daniel Boone National Forest covers 700,000 acres of some of the most biodiverse woodland in North America. It's home to endangered species, ancient trees, and culturally significant sites that predate European settlement by over 1,000 years. We're going to teach you to see this place the way it deserves to be seen. Most of us just nodded and waited for her to tell us where to start picking up beer cans. The work itself wasn't terrible at first. Trail maintenance mostly. Clearing fallen branches, fixing wooden steps and bridges, replacing trail markers that had gotten damaged by weather or stolen by souvenir hunters. We'd spend entire days hauling garbage bags full of litter that careless hikers and campers had left behind. Sometimes we'd pull invasive species that were choking out native plants, or repair erosion damage from people who'd cut switchbacks to save time. But none of us took it seriously. We did the bare minimum we could get away with. Half-filled garbage bags, sloppy repairs that looked good enough from a distance. Figured nobody would come back to check our work anyway. During lunch breaks, we'd complain about giving up our weekends, about how the whole system was designed to exploit free labor from people who couldn't afford real lawyers. After work hours, when we were camping at designated sites to access remote trail sections, we treated the whole thing like a party. Someone always had contraband alcohol hidden in their gear. We'd stay up late playing music from phone speakers, leaving food scraps around the campsite, ignoring every leave-no-trace principle Ranger Thompson had tried to teach us. She'd find evidence of our disrespect Monday morning and lecture us about forest stewardship and fire safety. We'd nod and promise to do better, then go right back to what we were doing. 3 weekends in, they assigned us to work in a section of forest I'd never heard of. A remote area called Coomer Ridge, deep enough in the hills that you couldn't get cell service, and far enough from main trails that hardly anyone ever went there. The forest felt different back there. Older, quieter, like it was holding its breath. This area contains several Native American ceremonial sites. Ranger Thompson told us that Saturday morning, standing at a trailhead that looked more like a deer path than anything humans were supposed to use. Some of these sites are over 1,200 years old. They're protected by federal law and considered sacred by Cherokee and Shawnee communities. We're here to clear access trails for tribal members and archaeological researchers, but we do not disturb the sites themselves under any circumstances. We don't touch the stone formations. We don't move artifacts. We don't take photographs for social media. These places have been sacred longer than Christianity has existed in North America. We treat them with appropriate respect. She paused, studying our faces. The Cherokee have a saying, "The land remembers everything." I suggest you keep that in mind. The ceremonial sites were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Stone circles arranged in perfect geometric patterns, some small enough to step across, others large as basketball courts. Ancient burial mounds covered in centuries of moss and wildflowers. Rock faces carved with symbols that looked like they belonged in a museum, not scattered through Kentucky wilderness. Even the most cynical part of me had to admit it was impressive. But impressive doesn't change attitude, and our attitude was still shit. Kevin immediately started taking selfies in front of the stone circles, posting them to Instagram with captions about ancient aliens and mystical energy. Sarah and Lisa walked directly through the middle of ceremonial areas, talking loudly about how spiritual everything felt while crushing delicate ground cover plants under their boots. Marcus made jokes about Indian magic and pretended to perform rituals with his work tools. Tommy seemed genuinely fascinated by the carved symbols, but in a way that made me uncomfortable, like he was studying them for reasons that had nothing to do with respect. I wasn't any better. Found myself standing on top of stone circles while Kevin took photos, arms crossed like I'd conquered something. It felt rebellious, I guess. These old rules, these ancient taboos, what did they have to do with us? Just rocks in the woods, right? That attitude lasted exactly 1 week. The graffiti appeared on a Monday morning when we returned for our second weekend at Coomer Ridge. Someone, and I knew it was Kevin, though he never admitted it, had spray-painted Crew 2016 across the main ceremonial circle in bright orange letters, the same kind of tagging that had gotten me arrested in the first place. When Ranger Thompson found it, I thought she was going to radio for backup, and have us all arrested on federal charges. She stood in front of the defaced stones for a long time, not saying anything, her jaw working like she was chewing words too angry to speak out loud. "Destruction of federal historic sites is a felony," she finally said, her voice deadly quiet. "Desecration of Native American sacred sites is a hate crime. Which one of you wants to explain this to the FBI?" None of us said anything. We protected each other the way criminals do, through collective silence and shared guilt. But Kevin hadn't just vandalized the site. That weekend, I caught him showing off a carved stone artifact he'd stolen from one of the smaller ceremonial circles, a piece about the size of a tennis ball, covered in intricate symbols that looked hand-etched by someone with infinite patience and skill. He was planning to keep it as a souvenir, proof that he'd been somewhere most people would never see. I should have made him put it back. We all should have. Instead, we just shrugged and figured what was one small rock among thousands. By our fourth weekend, we'd gotten comfortable with disrespect. We broke tools accidentally to make work go slower, dumped soapy dishwater directly into streams, carved our initials in protected trees, left food waste scattered around campsites for wild animals to get sick on. We treated 700,000 acres of protected wilderness like our personal garbage dump. That's when Ranger Thompson assigned us to the most remote campsite she could find, a spot so far back in the Coomer Ridge area that the nearest road was 8 miles away through unmarked forest. No cell service, no other campers, no way to call for help if something went wrong. "Last weekend," she told us Friday afternoon, "you finish this project, your community service is done. Try not to burn the forest down." Looking back, I think she knew something was going to happen. The way she looked at us when she left. Not angry anymore, but almost sad. Like she was sorry for what we were about to learn. The campsite sat in a clearing surrounded by white oaks that must have been growing when Daniel Boone himself walked these hills. Ancient trees with trunks so thick it would take 4 people holding hands to circle them. The ceremonial sites were scattered throughout the area, stone circles hidden in groves of cedar, burial mounds rising from forest floors carpeted with centuries of fallen leaves. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like trespassing. Saturday's work went the same as always. Minimal effort, maximum complaint. We cleared maybe half the trails we were supposed to clear, did repairs that would fall apart in the first good storm, left trash bags half filled because nobody was going to count our garbage. That night, we celebrated our impending freedom with the biggest party yet. Someone had smuggled in a whole cooler of beer. We cranked music from a Bluetooth speaker, played drinking games around our campfire, threw empty cans toward the woods without caring where they landed. When nature called, we pissed wherever was convenient instead of using the composting toilet Ranger Thompson had specifically set up for us. Around midnight, Kevin decided to do some authentic graffiti on the nearest ceremonial circle, a perfect ring of standing stones about 30 feet across. He grabbed a can of red spray paint from his pack and started tagging his initials across stones that had stood unmarked for over 1,000 years. "Dude, maybe don't," Tommy said, but without any real conviction. "Who's gonna stop me?" Kevin laughed. "The ghost police?" He finished his masterpiece, KM 2016 in letters 3 feet tall, then tossed the empty paint can into the ceremonial circle like he was making a basketball shot. That's when the forest decided it had tolerated enough. The first thing that went wrong was the paint. Not Kevin's spray paint, all of our spray paint. Every can of the stuff any of us had brought for marking trees or tools or whatever excuse we'd used to justify carrying it. Around 2 a.m., Every single canister exploded simultaneously with the sound of small grenades going off. I woke up to Marcus screaming and the overwhelming smell of chemical fumes thick enough to choke on. Paint had erupted from 6 different locations around our campsite with enough force to coat everything in a radius of 20 feet. Tents, sleeping bags, backpacks, food supplies, all of it covered in a toxic rainbow that burned our eyes and made breathing feel like drowning in turpentine. Kevin got the worst of it. He'd been sleeping with that stolen carving in his jacket pocket, and when his paint can exploded, the red spray paint soaked through the fabric and seemed to react with the carved stone. The artifact started glowing like a coal from the fire, burning against his chest, through his clothes. He tried to throw it away, but every time he managed to get the thing out of his pocket, it would reappear in his hands within minutes. Not like magic, more like gravity, like it was falling toward him from some direction that didn't exist in normal space. By dawn, we'd figured out that the paint explosion was just the opening move. Every tool we'd broken or sabotaged over 4 weekends came back to hurt us. The shovel handle Marcus had cracked gave him a fistful of splinters that went bone deep. The rake tines Sarah had bent started cutting her palms every time she touched them. The axe Tommy had loosened flew off its handle when he tried to split kindling for a new fire, missing his foot by inches and embedding itself in a tree trunk with a sound like a rifle shot. All the garbage we'd scattered through Coomer Ridge over the past month reappeared at our campsite. Not just recent trash. Everything we'd left behind, collected and deposited in neat piles around our tents like evidence in a court case. Cigarette butts, food wrappers, empty bottles, used toilet paper, months of accumulated disrespect, organized and displayed for our inspection. The stream we'd been dumping our dishwater into became the only available water source, and everything we tried to drink tasted like soap and grease and made us violently sick. But we were 8 miles from the nearest road, and our water bottles had been contaminated by the paint explosion. We had to choose between dehydration and poisoning ourselves with our own pollution. Around noon Sunday, the ground started shaking. Not earthquake shaking, more purposeful than that. The vibrations came in a steady rhythm, like massive footsteps underneath the earth. They were centered on the ceremonial circle Kevin had vandalized, spreading outward in waves that made our teeth ache and our inner ears feel like we were spinning. Our camping gear started falling apart in ways that defied explanation. Tent stakes pulled themselves out of the ground. Sleeping bags developed tears that spread like living things. Camp chairs collapsed under people who'd been sitting in them all weekend. Fire logs rolled away from our fire pit and scattered themselves through the forest. Kevin's stolen artifact kept getting hotter. The red paint on his clothes had dried into some kind of phosphorescent coating that glowed brighter as his panic increased. He'd managed to get the carving out of his pocket again, but now it was burning his hands every time he touched it, and letting go didn't help because the thing kept returning like a boomerang made of stone and heat. That's when the forest started redecorating. Our graffiti, not just Kevin's fresh vandalism, but every mark we'd made over 4 weekends of disrespect, appeared on every surface around the campsite. Trees, rocks, fallen logs, even the sides of our tents. Crew 2016 and KM and all our carved initials, repeated hundreds of times like the forest was showing us exactly how much damage we'd done. But they weren't perfect copies. Some of the letters were backwards, some were upside down, some were written in languages none of us recognized, using symbols that looked like combinations of our graffiti and the ancient carvings from the ceremonial sites. The wildlife turned hostile in ways that made no evolutionary sense. Squirrels threw acorns at us with the accuracy of trained snipers. Birds dove at our faces in coordinated attacks. Clouds of gnats and mosquitoes followed us everywhere, so thick we couldn't breathe without inhaling insects. But the animals stayed exactly at the edge of our campsite, like something was directing them to harass us without actually entering our space. Every trail out of the area became impassable. Trees that had been standing fine on Saturday were now fallen across every path. Rock slides had blocked the wider trails. Creek beds we'd crossed easily before were now torrents too deep and fast to wade through. The forest had rearranged itself overnight to keep us trapped. Our electronic devices stopped working in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random failure. Cell phones displayed GPS coordinates that put us in different states. Tommy's emergency radio picked up stations broadcasting in languages that sounded like combinations of Cherokee and something older. Digital cameras showed images of the campsite from impossible angles, like they were taking pictures from underground. Monday morning, we started seeing them, figures moving through the trees around our campsite. Native American people in traditional clothing, but translucent, like they were made of morning mist and shadow. They didn't approach us directly, just watched from a distance with expressions of infinite patience and growing disappointment. Some looked ancient, elders with faces carved by centuries of weather. Others looked young, maybe our age, maybe younger. All of them looked like they'd been waiting a very long time for someone to answer for what we'd done to their sacred places. The temperature around our camp dropped 20 degrees while the rest of the forest stayed summer warm. We shivered in our paint-stained clothes and tried to keep a fire going with wet wood, while birds sang happily just beyond the invisible boundary that seemed to mark our prison. Kevin was the first to break. By Tuesday, yes, Tuesday, because the forest wasn't letting us leave on schedule, he was sobbing constantly, clutching that burning artifact and begging it to stop hurting him. The red paint on his clothes had started moving, forming new patterns and symbols that looked like the carvings from the ceremonial sites. "I'm sorry," he kept saying over and over. I'm sorry, I'll put it back. I'll clean the paint off, just please make it stop." But the forest wasn't interested in apologies. Tuesday night, the ghostly figures came closer. They formed a circle around our campsite just outside the firelight and began to speak in voices that sounded like wind through dry leaves. We couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. This is what happens when you desecrate sacred ground. This is what happens when you treat ancient places like they belong to you. Wednesday, Marcus tried to hike out alone. He made it maybe half a mile before the trail deposited him right back at our campsite, like he'd been walking in a circle. The ghostly watchers seemed amused by this, nodding to each other with expressions that said, "You see, some lessons cannot be escaped." Thursday, Lisa started finding objects in her backpack that she hadn't put there. Stone carvings similar to Kevin's artifact, but older, more complex. They were cold to the touch instead of burning hot, but they had the same gravity effect. No matter how many times she threw them away, they reappeared in her possession. When she tried to examine them closely, the symbols seemed to move, rearranging themselves into new patterns that hurt to look at directly. By Friday, we understood that the forest had no intention of letting us leave until we'd learned something we were apparently too stupid to figure out on our own. The ghostly watchers began to show us things. Visions, maybe, or memories preserved in the land itself. We saw the ceremonial sites as they'd been centuries ago, places of worship and healing where tribal communities had gathered to mark seasons and honor the dead. We saw children playing where we'd carved our initials. We saw elders teaching young people to read the symbols on the carved stones, passing down knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate. We saw what we'd destroyed, not just with spray paint and theft, but with our fundamental lack of understanding about what these places meant to people who'd considered them sacred for over 1,000 years. Saturday, a full week after we were supposed to go home, Tommy found a solution that wasn't really a solution at all. He'd been studying the symbols on the ceremonial stones, trying to understand the language or the meaning behind them. That morning, he gathered us around the main circle and pointed to a section of carving that had been partially obscured by Kevin's graffiti. "I think I figured out what this says," he said, his voice hoarse from days of breathing paint fumes and fear. "It's not just decorative, it's instructions, or maybe a warning." He traced the symbols with his finger, careful not to actually touch the stone. "This part here, it's repeated on every stone circle in the area. As far as I can tell, it translates to something like, sacred ground remembers, sacred ground judges, sacred ground keeps what it claims." Lisa looked around at the ghostly figures, who were nodding approval. "Keeps what it claims. What does that mean?" Kevin knew. We all knew, but Kevin was the first to say it out loud. "It means we're not leaving." The realization hit us with the weight of absolute truth. The forest hadn't been punishing us to teach us a lesson. It had been preparing us for permanent residency. The ghostly watchers weren't there to judge our behavior. They were there to welcome new members to their eternal community service project. The symbols on the stones weren't just decorative or ceremonial. They were a contract written in stone, specifying the terms and conditions for entering sacred ground without permission. And we'd signed that contract the moment we'd started treating the place like it belonged to us. Sunday morning, 8 days into what should have been a 3-day camping trip, Ranger Thompson found our abandoned campsite. All our gear was there, neatly arranged, but covered in that strange glowing paint that hurt to look at directly. Our cell phones and cameras had been stacked in the center of the main ceremonial circle, their screens displaying a continuous slideshow of every disrespectful act we'd committed over 4 weekends. The garbage we'd scattered was organized in precise patterns around the stone circle, forming symbols that matched the ancient carvings. But we weren't there. The official report listed us as missing persons, presumed dead after an extended search found no trace of us beyond the campsite. Our families held memorial services. The community service program was restructured to ensure better supervision and smaller groups. Ranger Thompson requested transfer to a different forest. But we're still here. Not dead, exactly. Not alive in any way that makes sense to people who haven't signed the contract written in stone. We exist in the spaces between daylight and shadow, visible to visitors who treat the sacred sites with genuine respect, invisible to those who come with cameras and selfie sticks. We maintain the trails now. Real maintenance, not the half-assed job we did when we thought we were smarter than 1,000-year-old wisdom. We clear fallen branches, repair erosion damage, pick up litter left by careless hikers. We guide lost visitors back to marked paths, though they usually can't see us directly. Just glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, voices that sound like wind suggesting they turn left at the next fork. Kevin still carries that carved artifact, though it doesn't burn him anymore. It's part of him now, the way sacred objects become part of people who finally understand their significance. He's become the guardian of the stone circles, ensuring that other vandals don't make the same mistake we made. When disrespectful visitors show up with spray paint or souvenir hunting intentions, Kevin appears just long enough to convince them that leaving immediately would be in their best interest. The rest of us have our own assignments. Marcus monitors the streams, making sure nobody pollutes the water sources that feed into the broader watershed. Sarah and Lisa maintain the burial mounds, keeping them clear of invasive plants and protecting them from unauthorized archaeological disturbance. Tommy has become something like a translator, helping researchers who approach the sites with proper respect to understand the meaning behind the carved symbols. As for me, I meet new community service crews when they're assigned to work in our area. I try to teach them what Ranger Thompson tried to teach us, that some places demand you earn the right to be there, that sacred ground remembers everything, that the forest has been keeping score for a lot longer than any of us have been alive. Most of them listen better than we did. Word has gotten around about the crew that disappeared in 2016, and most offenders approach the work with a level of respect that would have saved us if we'd been smart enough to show it. But every few years, there's a group like ours. Young, angry, convinced that the world owes them something. They carve initials in protected trees, leave garbage in sacred spaces, treat thousand-year-old ceremonial sites like their personal playground. When that happens, the forest starts keeping score again. The ground remembers everything. The stones have infinite patience, and sacred places protect themselves by ensuring that those who desecrate them understand, eventually and permanently, the true meaning of the word service. I'm telling you this story as a warning, not because I expect you to believe it. If you're planning to visit Daniel Boone National Forest or any other place where people have marked the land as sacred, remember that respect isn't just polite behavior. It's a survival skill. The wilderness doesn't care about your community service assignment or your probation requirements or your opinion about ancient cultures you don't understand. It only cares whether you've learned to see sacred ground for what it really is, a contract written in stone specifying the terms and conditions for temporary residence. Break that contract, and you might find yourself signing up for a much longer commitment than you planned. The forest is always hiring. The benefits package is terrible, but the job security is absolute. And we're always here to help new employees understand their responsibilities. I'm 29 years old, and up until last year, I was serving tables at a chain restaurant in Memphis, trying to make ends meet like everyone else. But when my mom got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, everything I thought I knew about my life just fell apart. The treatment costs were insane. Chemo, radiation, experimental drugs that insurance wouldn't cover. We burned through her savings in 3 months, then mine, then started taking out loans against everything we owned. Mom fought hard for 18 months, but the cancer won anyway. She died on a Tuesday morning in February, and I was left holding $180,000 in medical debt that I had no way of paying. The collection calls started before we even had the funeral. 20, 30 calls a day from different agencies, all wanting money I didn't have. They repossessed my car in March, right there in the restaurant parking lot during my lunch shift. My manager had to drive me home that day, and I could see the pity in his eyes. That's when I knew I had to get out of Memphis. I couldn't think straight with those phone calls, couldn't sleep, couldn't figure out any way forward that didn't involve bankruptcy or worse. So I took the last $300 from my checking account, bought some basic camping gear at Walmart, and drove my mom's old Honda Civic east toward the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my few friends, not my uncle in Little Rock, nobody. I just needed to disappear for a while and figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life. I'd been camping maybe 3 times as a kid, so I wasn't exactly an outdoorsman, but I found this dispersed camping area about 15 miles off the main forest road, way back where you needed 4-wheel drive to get there safely. Mom's Honda wasn't built for that kind of terrain, but I took it slow and made it work. The spot I picked was perfect, a little clearing next to a fast-moving creek surrounded by thick woods that would hide me from any rangers or park officials. No cell service, no people, just me and the sounds of running water and wind through the trees. For the first time since Mom's diagnosis 2 years earlier, I felt like I could actually breathe. The first week went better than I'd expected. I set up my tent properly, learned how to build a fire that would actually stay lit, figured out how to filter creek water through the little camping filter I'd bought. I had enough canned food to last 3 weeks if I was careful, and the weather was perfect. Late spring in East Tennessee, with cool nights and warm days that dried out my clothes when they got damp. I started reading this paperback novel I'd grabbed from the library before leaving Memphis, and for a few hours each day, I could actually forget about the debt collectors and the impossible situation waiting for me back in the real world. I developed a routine pretty quickly. Wake up around sunrise, get the fire going. Again, heat up some coffee and whatever canned breakfast I was eating that day. Spend the morning gathering firewood and maintaining my little campsite. Then the afternoon reading or just walking around the forest, learning the lay of the land. The creek was only about 200 yards from my tent, so water was never an issue, and I'd found several good spots where fallen trees made natural benches for sitting and thinking. There were deer everywhere, and squirrels, and more bird species than I'd ever noticed in the city. They pretty much ignored me after the first few days, like I was just another part of the landscape. What surprised me most was how good I slept out there. Back in Memphis, I'd been lucky to get 4 hours a night with all the stress and the phone calls starting at 7 a.m. sharp. But in the woods, with nothing but the sound of the creek and the wind, I'd fall asleep as soon as my head hit the inflatable pillow and sleep straight through until dawn. Deep, dreamless sleep that left me feeling more rested than I'd been in years. For the first time since Mom died, I started believing that maybe I could actually figure this out, maybe start over somewhere completely new where the debt collectors couldn't find me. By the end of the second week, I was feeling almost confident about my situation. I'd done some research at the library before leaving Memphis, and I knew that in some states, they couldn't garnish wages for medical debt. Maybe I could drive west, find work in Montana or Colorado, somewhere with different laws and a fresh start. Or maybe I could just stay in the forest longer, really learn how to live off the land, disappear completely from the system that was crushing me. It sounds crazy now, but at the time, it felt like the first realistic plan I'd had in months. That's when everything started going wrong. It began with the creek. On a Wednesday morning, I know it was Wednesday because I'd been keeping track of days by marking them on a piece of paper. I went down to fill my water containers like I did every morning, and the water looked different. Not clear and fast-moving like it had been for 2 weeks, but kind of greenish and sluggish with a smell like old eggs. There were dead fish floating in the slower pools, mostly small ones, but enough that I knew something was seriously wrong. I hiked upstream about a mile to see if maybe there was a dead animal or something contaminating the water, but I couldn't find anything obvious. The smell got stronger as I got closer to camp, though, like the problem was concentrated right in my area. I had maybe 2 days' worth of filtered water left in my containers, so I wasn't in immediate danger, but losing my water source was a big problem. I started rationing what I had and hoping the creek would clear up in a day or two, but it didn't. If anything, it got worse. The smell became so strong I could taste it in the air, and by Friday, the water was completely stagnant, not flowing at all. That should have been impossible. It was a decent-sized creek fed by springs higher up in the mountains, and we'd had rain just a few days earlier. But the water level kept dropping until there were just isolated pools connected by trickles, all of them full of that same green, stinking mess. Then the weather got weird. According to the little radio I'd brought, we were supposed to get rain that weekend, but the sky stayed completely clear. Not just sunny, I mean absolutely cloudless. like someone had scrubbed the blue clean. The temperature started swinging wildly too, from near freezing at night to almost 90 degrees during the day. I'd wake up shivering and have to put on every piece of clothing I'd brought. Then by noon, I'd be sweating through my shirt and desperately looking for shade. The weather patterns made no sense at all. Even stranger was what happened to all the animals. For 2 weeks, the forest had been full of life. Birds singing from before dawn until after dark, squirrels chattering in the trees, deer walking through my camp like they owned the place. But sometime during that first bad weekend, everything just stopped. I woke up Saturday morning to complete silence. No bird song, no insect buzzing, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like every living thing had evacuated the area overnight, leaving just me and the dead creek and the unnaturally clear sky. I tried to stay rational about it. Maybe there was a forest fire somewhere upwind that I couldn't smell yet, driving the animals away. Maybe the creek was contaminated by some kind of mining runoff or agricultural chemicals from farms outside the forest. These things had logical explanations, even if I couldn't figure out exactly what they were. But deep down, I was starting to get a bad feeling about the whole situation. The firewood situation got worse too. Even though it hadn't rained, every piece of fallen wood I tried to collect was soaking wet, like it had been sitting in a swamp for weeks. I couldn't get a decent fire going no matter what I tried, which meant no cooked food and no warmth during those freezing nights. I'd brought some of those chemical hand warmers, but I only had a few of them, and I was saving them for emergencies. Sitting in my tent after dark, listening to the absolute silence outside, I started wondering if maybe this qualified as an emergency. By Sunday, I was getting seriously worried. I had maybe 12 hours worth of filtered water left, the creek was completely unusable, and I hadn't eaten anything hot in 3 days. Worse, when I tried to hike out to where I'd parked the Honda, I kept getting turned around on trails I thought I knew perfectly. I'd been walking the same paths for 2 weeks, had them memorized like the layout of my old apartment, but suddenly they seemed to go in different directions than I remembered. My compass started acting up too, spinning around like it couldn't find magnetic north, and the GPS on my phone couldn't get a satellite signal even in clear areas where it had worked fine before. That's when I realized I might be in real trouble, not just inconvenienced or uncomfortable, but actually in danger of dying out there if I couldn't find my way back to the car. I tried to stay calm and think through my options logically, but the combination of dehydration, hunger, and that oppressive silence was making it hard to concentrate. Everything about the forest felt wrong now, like the place that had been my sanctuary for 2 weeks had turned hostile overnight. Monday morning, I packed up everything I could carry and started hiking toward where I thought I'd left the car. But after walking for 6 hours in what should have been the right direction, I found myself back at my old campsite by the dead creek. I tried again Tuesday, taking a completely different route and marking trees with my knife so I'd know if I was going in circles. Same result, 6 hours of hiking through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. Then suddenly I'm standing next to my abandoned tent, like the forest had just deposited me back where I started. That night was the worst yet. The temperature dropped so fast I could actually feel it happening, like someone was sucking all the heat out of the air around me. I put on every piece of clothing I had and crawled into my sleeping bag, but I still couldn't stop shivering. The silence was so complete, it felt like pressure in my ears, and I kept thinking I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, just at the edge of perception. I didn't sleep at all, just lay there listening and trying not to panic. Wednesday, I gave up on finding the car and focused on survival. I was completely out of water by then, getting dizzy and nauseous from dehydration. so I boiled some of the creek water despite the smell and taste. It made me violently sick within an hour, throwing up what little food I had left in my system, then dry heaving until my ribs ached. I tried to catch rainwater in my cooking pot, but of course it still wasn't raining despite the weather forecasts. The sky stayed that same impossible blue, like a painting of what sky should look like rather than actual weather. I started having weird thoughts around that time, probably from the dehydration and hunger, but they felt more real than my actual memories of Memphis and the debt collectors. It was like the forest was communicating with me somehow, not through sounds or visions, but through direct understanding planted in my head. The message was pretty clear. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was running away from my responsibilities, hiding from problems that I needed to face, and the mountains weren't going to shelter someone who was essentially stealing from the people he owed money to. It sounds insane, I know, but in my dehydrated, desperate state, it made perfect sense. The forest was rejecting me because I was morally in the wrong. The creek had died because I was poisoning the place with my cowardice. The animals had fled because they could sense that I didn't belong there, that I was contaminating their home with my refusal to deal with my problems like an adult. Every system failure, every wrong turn, every impossible weather pattern was the mountain's way of telling me to go back to Memphis and face what I'd done. Thursday morning, I made my decision. I was going to die out there if I kept trying to hide, and maybe that was what I deserved. But I wasn't ready to give up completely. I packed up my gear one more time and started hiking, but instead of trying to find the car, I focused on getting to any road, any sign of civilization where I could call for help. And for the first time in a week, the forest seemed to cooperate with me. The trail I chose led steadily downhill toward what I hoped was the main forest road. The compass worked properly, pointing due north like it was supposed to. I could hear birds again, just a few at first, then more and more as I got farther from my campsite. The air started tasting normal instead of that metallic, chemical flavor I'd been breathing for days. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I found a gravel service road that I recognized from when I'd driven in 2 weeks earlier. My Honda was exactly where I'd left it, covered in pollen and tree sap, but otherwise fine. The engine started on the first try, and my phone immediately showed full signal strength. I had 47 missed calls from various collection agencies, 12 voicemails, and about 30 text messages demanding payment or threatening legal action. For the first time in my life, I was actually glad to see those messages. They meant I was back in the real world where problems had solutions, even if they were difficult ones. I drove straight to the nearest town and called my uncle in Little Rock from a McDonald's parking lot. I'd been too proud to ask him for help before, but pride was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. He offered me a job with his construction company and a place to stay while I got back on my feet, no questions asked. Then I called one of the debt collectors back and explained my situation honestly, that I wanted to pay what I could but needed to set up a realistic payment plan. They were surprisingly willing to work with me once I stopped avoiding their calls. Over the next few months, I learned about medical bankruptcy laws, charity care programs, and debt forgiveness options that I'd never known existed. It turned out that most of my mom's hospital bills qualified for financial hardship assistance, and the collection agencies were legally required to accept payment plans based on my actual income. Within a year, I'd eliminated about 60% of the debt, and had the rest structured into payments I could actually afford. I never went back to Cherokee National Forest. I drive past the entrance sometimes when I'm traveling between Little Rock and Memphis to visit friends, and I always think about that campsite by the dead creek. I still don't know if what happened out there was real or just my mind breaking down from stress and dehydration. But I learned something important during those 2 weeks. even if I can't explain exactly how I learned it. Running away from your problems doesn't make them go away. It just gives them time to grow bigger while you're not looking. And sometimes, when you try to hide from your responsibilities, the world itself will conspire to push you back toward doing the right thing. I work construction now, making better money than I ever did serving tables, and I've got health insurance that would actually cover a real medical emergency. The debt collectors don't call anymore because I'm current on all my payments. Most importantly, I sleep fine at night, even when there are problems I need to deal with the next day. Because I know now that facing difficult situations head-on is always better than trying to disappear into the woods and pretending they don't exist. The mountains taught me that lesson in a way I'll never forget, even if I still don't fully understand how they did it.